Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Innovative Universities webinar. Our today's guest speaker is Veda Sunasi, the CEO of African Leadership University, which has turned out to be the most anticipated case of this season of our webinar. It's time for Africa. Globally, and for our webinar as well. African Leadership University belongs to the African Leadership Group, which also has African Leadership Academy, a pre-university program, and LAX, a huge platform that trains tech talent. Now, Veda has seen it all, having served in different roles across the group. So he also brings that perspective to our conversation today. Veda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It is always such a pleasure to engage with a kindred community of people who are trying to, reimagine education and asking all the right questions. So thinking about innovation. I believe I have now the power to control my slides. So welcome everyone. I want to start with this quote because I think it's relevant to the conversation that we're going to have from Yuval Harari in his book Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow. He says, traditionally life has been divided into two main parts, a period of learning followed by a period of working. Very soon, this traditional model will become utterly obsolete, and the only way for humans to stay in the game will be to keep learning throughout their lives and to reinvent themselves repeatedly. Many, if not most humans, may be unable to do so. And I wanted to start with this to keep at the back of our minds, because I think that reality is already here. That we today, have to, be nimble and versatile and be lifelong learners. And I hope that throughout my presentation, you're going to get a better sense of how we at the African Leadership University does that. But before I get there, I think we need to backtrack a little bit and ask this question: why, above all, do we need to reimagine education? And obviously, I want to talk about the African context, right? And why should we be reimagining education in Africa? And my focus will obviously be primarily around higher education in Africa. And context matters. We all come from, we've got a history that we've got to honor, that we need to learn from. And I wanted to take a few minutes to contextualize why the solution that the African Leadership University has put into the world is what it is, and where it comes from, and what has informed this solution in this format that you're going to see it. So context matters. Let's start with one important context, and that's just the state of the African continent. As you can see on this slide, I may have moved a little too fast. As you can see on this slide, we're talking about a continent that has a population as of today of about 1.4 billion people. It has a median age of 18.8. Anybody who is good and fast at math can calculate the number of people who are under the age of 18.8, 19, if you will. And that's about 700 million young people. That number is just bonkers, isn't it? Right? 700 million young people under the age of 19 on one continent. It is, in fact, said in many quarters, a lot of research suggests that by the turn of the century, by 2100, about 40% of the entire world's population is going to be African. That's almost 1 in every 2 people in the entire world that is meant to be African. So while the rest of the world is aging, Africa is super young and is going to be young for the foreseeable future. And yet you're looking at a continent whereby only 9.4 people who are meant to be in higher ed is currently in higher ed, right? The technical term that we often use for this is this thing called a gross enrollment ratio. And the global average is actually 38%. And in the global north, that number is typically above 50%. So that's very concerning. And for us as a group, as the African Leadership Group, and obviously as the African Leadership University, that number spoke to us in a very visceral way. And we felt that it's very important for us to do something about it. How do we do it? I'll tell you about that in a minute or so. Something else to sort of bear in mind about Africa is that while it is super young, yeah, according to the African Development Bank, between 10 to 12 million young people is entering the African labor market every year, but they are chasing only 3 million formal jobs. So first, you've got an uneducated population. You don't have enough people who are in higher ed, and yet of that 9.7%. That are coming out with a university degree, look at this ratio, right, of how many jobs, formal jobs, are available and how many people are chasing those jobs. And I'm not even getting into what the, sort of entry-level salary is like for these 3 million people who are actually going to get those jobs. So you obviously get a big issue here, right? It is also said that anywhere between half to 80% of this workforce that's global, not just in Africa, is going to be operating in the gig economy, right? That's massive. So it means that whatever education that you are giving formally, you kind of need to prepare for a talent that will operate in a world where they will not have a fixed employment, they will not have one employer, they will be their own employer, and they will be offering their services for employers to secure. And that's a reality that we have to pay attention to in terms of how we design education solutions, right? 70% of the continent's population, as I said already, right? Median age is 19. That's 700 million people under the age of 19. Out of 1.4 billion, 70% is still super young, right? Age 30 or below. So we have to, again, look at how do you reskill or upskill some of the people who may have already missed out on higher ed, but are important contributors to the African and the global economy. So again, as you think about lifelong learning solutions, as we think about lifelong learning solutions in Africa, these are things that we have to bear in mind, right? And the top 10 countries in the world with the highest unemployment rate is unfortunately in Africa, right? That is the context within which we are trying to design to train people to become, as you can see here, not just job seekers. If you're a job seeker, you fall into that 3 million category, but we need them to be job creators as well, so they can fill that gap in the 10 to 12 million that are waiting for wage jobs. So a few more data points, right, as we contextualize this solution that is the African Leadership University. Between the year 2000 and 2014, Africa's labor force grew by 3% a year, and yet employment expanded by only 1.8%, right? Which means that by 2020, over 20% of young people in Africa were not in employment, not in education, or not in formal training. And by the year 2032, we are looking at the number of sub-Saharan Africans entering the workforce will be more than the rest of the world combined. That includes India and China, right? So it's a reality that's going to hit us very, very, very soon, in less than a decade. And we are very ill prepared for that African youth. There's another report that mentioned, this is more of a global context again, that 65% of people, children entering primary school today will be working in new job types that do not exist yet, which begs the question then again, as you design your education solution, how do you build an education solution, a program, a university education that prepares people for jobs that don't exist yet, right? And that's something also that we have to bear in mind, which I hope I will be able to show you later on how it factored into the design of our programming. That was context number one. Let me talk about context number two, which is the state of higher education. And I understand this can be very controversial sometimes, and the attendees can agree and disagree with me on this one, but I hope that I will back it with data to make some of these claims that I'm about to make about the state of higher education. Before I do that, I think all of us can agree that a theory of change concept applies to obviously any organization, and then obviously in higher ed as well. a theory of change in any university, any higher learning institution, there is typically a theory of change. You have some input, some resources, and some activities. Resources, your faculty, activities, your learning programs. And then there's some output, right? And outcomes. Learners acquire necessary skills and mindset. And allegedly, that has an impact in the world, and the world is a better place, right? I would posit that historically, in higher ed, we have focused far more disproportionately on inputs and looked at inputs as indicators of quality in the world. And some of these inputs would be things like, your infrastructure, right? The type of buildings that you have, the types of labs that you have, how big is your building, etc. Resources, again, how fancy is your faculty? Have they, are they superstars? Have they worked at the World Bank? Have they worked, for government, right? And obviously there are other non-human resources as well that factor in here. And obviously then qualifications. All of us who are in higher ed know that regulators care deeply about the qualifications faculty, and yeah, rightly so. But again, in the context that I was talking about in Africa right now, we have a massive shortage of people with these types of qualifications that would be required in a Western context that make it difficult to be able to deliver higher learning at the scale that is required, given the numbers I shared with you earlier. In fact, if you look at university rankings, at least in the US and the Western world, it's interesting, right, to find how the list correlates very strongly with how big your endowment is, how much resources you have, in other words, how rich you are. Surely it does beg the question of, is that a fair way to look at what constitutes quality, and should that be a framework or a rubric, if you will, that should extend to the rest of the world and to all other institutions in the world? When we were, and then obviously, again, allegedly controversial, but I have oodles of stories that I could tell, but I have limited time to tell you the stories around how, a lot of the regulatory frameworks on the continent are, frankly, archaic or obsolete, right? We've inherited a lot of these models that honestly, frankly, do not serve the current reality of the continent. And yet very often we get obsessed about these frameworks, and I think it's holding us back. An example, two short stories here. I won't name the country, but there's a country on the continent that requires you to have 100 hectares of land just to be eligible to start a university. As you can imagine, this is not something that comes easy to a lot of people, including people who've got very good ideas to address their educational needs. When I was in Rwanda, we said to the regulators when we were doing accreditation that we are giving laptops to all of our students. So they applauded. Yeah, this is great. Oh, where is your computer lab? Well, hold on. Everybody has a laptop. What do you mean a computer lab? Well, you need a computer lab. So I had a week to source lab computers from neighboring countries, which I couldn't find. So I had to go to Dubai, spent over $100,000. When they came back a year later to do a re-accreditation and evaluation, they went into the computer lab. Were there students there? They were. Were they sitting in front of computers? They were. But between the student and the computer was a laptop, which was kind of hilarious, but at the same time, makes you ask some serious questions about what are the things that we are measuring, input versus output. How did we respond to it, right? So the context I wanted to share, there's an African context, there's a higher education context. How did we go about it? Fred Swaneker, I think it's important to mention him as the founder of this university, known across the world as an entrepreneur, as an education entrepreneur. He sort of gave this TED talk in 2013. He talks about the leaders who ruined the African continent and the generation who can fix it, and essentially makes the case that the one thing that Africa has in abundance is the biggest resource it has is precisely its people, the youth. And how do we build, university that, can provide the right education for these young people to become job creators, not just job seekers, and to really advance the continent, right? So we are really on a mission to develop ethical entrepreneurial leaders for Africa. And when we said, okay, we want to build a world-class university in Africa, we said, okay, well, let's look at what would constitute world class. And I put Harvard here and Macalester here because Fred went there. And when you look at the pie chart of how they fund themselves, it's very similar for most of the American universities. You can see a big chunk of money come from philanthropy. And while even us as a young, barely 10-year-old university, we do rely quite a bit on philanthropy, we all know that this model is just not feasible or realistic in an African context, because just these universities rely on hundreds of years of alumni success, and we are nowhere near there. So you can't build models that are you cannot model your solution on what exists in those spaces, right? What is agreed generally as world class. So quickly realize that we need African-centric innovations. In fact, what I share with you below, this idea that we needed approximately 2,700 Harvard-sized universities, was when we did the calculation. We built a model and we said, if we want to move, at the time we started this journey, the gross enrollment ratio was 8%. And we said, if we were to move from 8% to 18%, which is what India did in about 15 to 20 years, in an African context, how many Harvard-sized universities would we have to build if you were to copy, an exact model? It would come down to about something like this. So obviously that model is not doable, scalable. So we had to think differently. Based on the context and where the continent is, it became crystal clear to us that we need to construct education systems that prepare young people for an ever-changing labor market. They need to be agile. They need to be problem solvers. They need to be ethical leaders. If Fred made the case that we had leaders who failed Africa and we need new leaders who will fix it, well, I think we can all agree that ethical leadership is something that we absolutely desperately need on the continent, and that's a huge emphasis in our curriculum, in our programs. Entrepreneurial thinking, again, as I mentioned, job creators, not just job seekers. There's three things I want you guys to encode again as you think about what is the African Leadership University built upon. Upon this idea that we need to find an education model that is of quality, but that is also accessible, right? Because we have a huge problem of access on the continent. That's why the number is so low. And access is on the one hand, proximity, on the other hand, affordability as well, right? So we've been trying to design, sometimes I use sort of this framing that we are trying to find that perfect algorithm that allows you to optimize for quality while minimizing on cost, right? And you can only do that by bringing in innovation, bringing in technology, and also, frankly, questioning and flipping on its head some long-held fundamental tenets of pedagogy, right? Where does the ownership and the what is the role of the teacher? What is the role of the learner? Should some of these things be revisited, right? Could the learner be a teacher? Could the teacher play a different role? Can the learner learn from peers as well, not just from, is there only one source of truth, and that's the faculty, or are there others? And can you curate and scaffold that, right? So access. The second thing is, mission, not majors. When you're a continent like Africa, that there's no secret is lagging behind the rest of the world, you clearly need people who are, you need to educate people to advance the prosperity of the continent, which is why for us, we don't want our learners to just get an education as a ticket to seek a job opportunity, but rather as real, genuine problem solvers for an entire continent. Hence this concept of mission, not majors. So in our university, irrespective of your degree program, whether you're training to be an engineer, a software engineer, an electrical engineer, a business management student, every single one of them has to also declare a mission. My mission is to address the problem of urbanization in my home city of Lagos, Nigeria, right? And then you design and curate your learning around that mission statement, right? So you adapting your learning to problem solving as well. And lastly, a very core tenet of what we do is this idea of learning by doing, which again, I'm sure all educators on this call probably are aware. And the idea is that people are best suited to learn directly from the real world. So how do you design a learning experience again that makes them access the real world a lot sooner, a lot faster. So instead of being cocooned for 3 to 4 years and then go into the real world, we bring the real world directly into the program. And I guess I could unpack that later on when we get to the Q&A session. Access for us means, again, proximity and cost and affordability. This amount that you see here, $3,000 in tuition, I know is still pricey, but then when you compare that to other parts of the world, it is still affordable. And we continue working towards how do you bring that cost even further down without, that's the design constraint that we give ourselves, without compromising on quality. So we're also trying to address the issue of access. So instead of getting people to come to fly to Rwanda or Mauritius, where we have our 2 campuses, can we build satellites, if you will, in the form of hubs in various cities? And as we speak, we do have hubs in some of these places that you see listed here, including, by the way, in the Bay Area in San Francisco, a Silicon Valley hub where we take students every year, where they get exposure to the best of entrepreneurship and tech in the world. Missions, not majors, right? We have what we call the 7 grand challenges and 7 great opportunities for Africa. Every student, again, irrespective of whether you're an engineer or a business student or an entrepreneurship student, everybody has to craft a mission. We provide them some guardrails around what we define as these 7 grand challenges for Africa and 7 great opportunities. As you can see, they do map quite closely with the SDGs, which is unsurprising, but we sort of try to channel our students' interest around these mission areas, if you will. And last but not least, this idea of learning by doing. We make sure that our students are, we give them access to the real world. You see a picture here of me and Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, giving a masterclass at the campus. And like that, we leverage our network. We bring in, a lot of visiting faculty, etc. But we also work with a lot of corporates in the real world to design projects in-house as part of the learning, but also our students have to go and do internships, mandatory internships. And you can see here on the right of your screen, a list of sort of the types of organizations we partner with for our students to get exposure and to learn from the real world while they are still students at the university before they go into the real world. Right. I'm going to close by bringing this theory of change back onto the screen. I made a case that the context in which we operate right now is one where higher learning focuses far more disproportionately on resources and activities and less so about impact. In our sort of reimagination that we are doing at ALU, we want to say to the world that, in fact, we need to begin here. And that's how you determine whether or not you are delivering outcome and impact into the real world. And this is actually what we track. We tracked how many of our alums go into employment, how many of our alums go into entrepreneurship. And you can see here some data points around the kinds of performance that our alums have in the real world once they have graduated. There's a slide that I forgot to add here, which is around entrepreneurship. 27% of our alums as undergraduate students go straight into entrepreneurship. And 40% of our alums are involved in entrepreneurship in one way or the other. We track how many jobs they have created. We've been graduating students since 2019. Out of, the alumni number is now 1,280. We just graduated about 200 students recently. And they have collectively already created upwards of 45,000 jobs, right? And then these are people who have barely crossed the age of 30, right? And these are the kind of metrics that we pay attention to precisely because we care about these issues of unemployment and on the continent. So for us, getting our students to become entrepreneurs and job creators and problem solvers is very important. And that's what we sort of base our own assessment and, and also trying to convince other players in the marketplace to consider those metrics as good measures of how a university is delivering quality or not. So again, I close with this quote that we are living in this world now where we have to be lifelong learners and people have to reinvent themselves. And through our model, missions not majors, and learning by doing, what we believe we are leaving our students with at the end of the day is a mindset and a set of skills to learn how to learn, so they can then reinvent themselves later on in their lives and in the world, especially as as we saw earlier, a lot of these jobs that are not created yet, they have to lean into those jobs or have to reskill themselves to go operate in those jobs. How do you facilitate that exercise of reskilling? By teaching people to learn how to learn, to become autodidactic, and that's what we'd like to think, and we do ensure that our learning and philosophy and our learning model is leading to. Let me rest my case here. I've gone way over time allocated to me. I'll pause and I'll hand it back to Dara and Isaac, and we can have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Veda. Isaac, would you mind if I start?
Please do. Please do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Veda, you started your introduction with the African context. How was the idea initially perceived on the continent? Who were the strongest supporters? Who were, let's say, more reserved? And how has that perception changed over the years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, the first thing I want to say is, so to answer your question directly, I think people who were most supportive of the idea were, again, that sort of kindred, a community of like-minded people who were thinking about reimagining education in Africa and elsewhere. The world of work, right? Employers have been saying in Africa and outside of Africa that people are not equipped to come into the labor force. They don't have the right skills, not have the right mindset. So, when they were looking at the time our ideas, they were very excited. Understandably, once you get to the regulators, a lot of the innovation that we were pushing for, they don't have the framework. They didn't have the frameworks for it. It was a lot more difficult. I have to give credit to them, though. In the 10 years that I've been in this space, I've seen a lot of change on the African continent in that space, a lot more, welcoming of innovation. And also, I think that the pandemic has been a wake-up call for everybody globally and on the continent as well, even though there still, are some challenges. And the thing is, at the end of the day, guys, the proof is in the pudding, right? Once you start graduating students and your students are hands down, outperforming their peers, they are earning wages that are 5x the average. They are getting rated, really highly by their employers. They are fast tracking in their growth and development in companies. Companies are now coming to us, well, have been coming to us for a while now and say, hey, that stuff that you make your student go through in their first year, I want that for my managers. Can you do, some training for me in the corporate world? So we do quite a bit of work in the exec ed, and we do bespoke programs for companies as well, right? So it's gotten a lot better, right? Now you've got the likes of, you've got our students are in the real world. They're building businesses, they're starting ventures, they're employing people, they are getting access to top university programs for postgrad. They are performing well in the world of work. So clearly, right, there's something in the model that there are more adopters, right? And obviously these guys are now our biggest ambassadors, and their parents are our biggest ambassadors.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Thank you.
Dara, yeah, I would start from a couple of very basic questions. What about the size of the enterprise now? How did you grow and how are you going to grow? Because I've read one of the papers by Fred Swaniker, and he mentioned that your group will produce 3 million leaders by 2035. It's an ambitious.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Before we started the university, as mentioned in the introduction earlier, we set up an academy in Johannesburg, South Africa. It's a high school Pan-African pre-university program. That's actually where I started my journey as an educator, and that's where I got to meet Fred. And there, we bring in every year about 120 of the best students from all over the continent and put them through this program, and quickly realized that not only were we losing them to the West, but it was just not the need is so big that this alone would not cut it. Came the idea of the university, right? So okay, let's do this at bigger scale, and build a product that is a bit more affordable and a bit more accessible than that sort of very premium experience that you get at that academy. As of today, when we started in 2015, I had 60 students. Today, I have 2,500 students. We are on a journey of growth, evidently, and we intend to grow further in the next few years. But interestingly, what Fred has gone on to do, partly because he was a bit exasperated and frustrated by how slow regulated higher education moves, and also partly because of just sort of the impatience to bring solutions when the demand is so big on the continent. So he's branched out of the sort of regulated higher ed space and now runs a program called ALX, which has been training primarily in the tech space, data science, software engineering, and a few others. But that one, they're doing it at pretty massive scale. They are enrolling hundreds of thousands of people in this program. And the idea is to get to a certain level of scale, by then. But here's something else is really interesting. Even though the African Leadership Academy in itself has not scaled as a school, by today, 17 years since its inception, a fair number of its students have gone on to be entrepreneurs in education themselves. I don't have the exact number, but the collective impact of the academy through sort of this trickle-down effect of its alumni is now massive, right? So the school itself continues to educate 250 people a year, but one of our alums, this guy, Majak Ngor from South Sudan, runs a school that I think by now already has 1,000 students. Another one of our alums runs a school in Algeria that has thousands of students. Another one in the DRC. So you see, there's the 3 million doesn't have to come directly from us, but it's sort of this paid forward and trickle down effect that we are looking at as well, right? That's just when you've started a movement, right? The movement is what carries
so
the vision forward.
You have a kind of multiplication effect. Yeah, it's
absolutely
it's very interesting. But still, let's look at 2000 that you have, and it's small university, but still it's bigger than quite a few European universities, and you need two things. I agree with you that we too often look at inputs, but you need at least students and professors, teachers. So first question, simple. Where do you get the professors for the university? Who is teaching?
Yeah, I mean, yes, you're right. Spot on. Yeah, we small, but very young. Yeah, 9 years old, and we can only grow from here, and that's the intention. We have because we remain very Pan-African. We have students from over 40 of the 54 African countries. That's a very important part of our identity because we genuinely believe that we are an institution that's pushing for sort of Pan-African prosperity, and we believe that our future and our prosperity is within our collective context and effort. But also we want to be, proudly African, but globally relevant and competitive, which means that we bring in talent from across the world as well. So our staff, faculty, and non-teaching staff are from over 25 different countries, from the West, from the US, from Europe, from other parts of Africa, from Asia, right? What is it, like 7:35 p.m. I'm still on a call right now, and I have calls even after this because I straddle team members who are all the way from India all the way to the US East Coast, right? And that's the beauty of being able to do some of these things, to be able to attract people. But it's like what I also say is that the innovation comes in where you are able to, again, tap from the expertise of people who are maybe in Stanford, right? But technology today allows you to be able to to get them access to your students, and your students get access to them as well. This is how we are essentially what we're doing is we're saying that learning doesn't have to happen within the confines of the brick and mortar that we have historically held as this is the ivory tower where learning happens, right? I think it can be decentralized, it can be democratized, it can be spread synchronous, asynchronous across multiple time zones, right? And that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, Dara, my last question in this part is that, okay, I got about the professors. It's a great answer, by the way. And I do think that we had in our webinar already some universities that really are not in the, that are really not in the centers, traditional academic centers, like in Bangladesh, in not in the capital city, in Pamir Mountains. And they are very clever, probably like you, in using the talents all over the world, working with students by distance. But as a colleague from University of Central Asia, which is in Pamir Mountain, mentioned that we have, he said, we have very motivated students. And indeed, when I visited African schools in Ethiopia, in Uganda, in Rwanda, by the way, I was quite impressed with curiosity, you know, some agency of the students. It was great. But we all know, unfortunately, that the quality of public education, even in Rwanda, which is quite, which is doing better and better, this quality is not is not sufficient to prepare students for challenging academic post-school program. So where do you get students from? From expensive private schools that are quite a lot in Africa, or from public schools where they don't receive strong preparation in basic subjects?
Yeah, it's such a really good question, and I'll tie that to a question I just sort of caught at the corner of my eye on the chat around sustainability. You're spot on, right? A lot of these, you can count maybe on two hands where are the education models in Africa that are definitely, you know, have certain level of rigor that is preparing people. Zimbabwe has got very good education system. Zambia, you know, parts of some schools in Tanzania, South Africa, you know, Senegal, I would argue West Africa does a decent job, Ivory Coast, etc. So because we are Pan-African in nature, yeah, you get students from some of these places, sometimes from private university schools and from public schools as well. But we have, you know, decent preparation to do rigorous higher ed. But then, yes, there are places like Rwanda where very often you get students who, you know, have language challenges or technology challenges, and you know, and a number of other issues. Thankfully, the government there is also quite proactive about this and acknowledges this issue, and I've been encouraging many institutions, ourselves included, to have sort of support programs, right? So we have, for instance, an English language program that is a very intensive boot camp that a number of these students who have language issues have to go through. We have other bridging programs that we've built that, you know, a lot of students who sort of, you know, need to bridge that gap would go through before they start, you know, the full-on program. And there are other programs, like you mentioned Rwanda. There's a really successful program in Rwanda called Bridge to Rwanda, right? That still identifies, you know, students of a certain caliber, but then put them through a very rigorous program to, you know, get them to that next level, right? To try to you know, sort of fix that sort of bridge the gap, essentially. But look, I think what you're also pointing at is there is major reform that is required at early childhood level, primary, secondary, and I think a number of countries in Africa have woken up to that reality and looking for, you know, improvement in those spaces. And you know, people sometimes ask me, like, why Mauritius and Rwanda? Why are you not in Nigeria? I mean, just look at the volumes. You wouldn't be at 2,000 students right now. You'd be at 10,000 students, right? And but the reality is, you know, when you are building something that you want to sustain, you want to start in places where, there is ease of doing business, there is sort of some relative, safety, security, but more importantly, the right policies from a government perspective that is encouraging you to be innovative and try to find good solutions. And just quickly to answer that question in the chat, yes, if you saw my slide earlier, I said we can't replicate the Western model where you rely massively on philanthropy. And we've been very lucky that we currently have the likes of Mastercard Foundation supporting us. But my mandate every single day when I wake up with in mind is financial sustainability and getting to a place where we are able to stand on our own 2 feet. I do hope that the future of the institution is one where we've been able to raise an endowment of sort, because look, again, we are lucky and privileged enough, I suppose, between the founder and myself, people who have been educated in the West, have big networks, good networks. We should be able to raise an endowment that will give a certain level of comfort to the institution, while at the same time, be able to innovatively, through the hubs and spoke, get closer to people who can afford, right? You look at, and I've spent the last 10 years doing this, being in different countries, whether it's Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, people, the middle class, if you will, in Africa, successful private universities in all of these countries, the average tuition is somewhere around $1,200 to $1,500, right? That's where you get to levels of scale. Now, the challenge for us is, okay, if this is the price point, how do you still force engineer innovation that does not allow you to drop your quality? And that's the difference. Again, you could always strip down your program and say, okay, I've got $200 spent on this, I can do it for 12, right? But you say, no, learning outcomes, these are the learning outcomes that we care about. How do you design with that in mind? And that forces you to be creative and innovative in ways that you otherwise wouldn't be.
Okay. Thank you. So I got the picture of inputs, Dara.
Thank you. And next time you're in Rwanda, definitely hit me up. I'd love to, show you the
Yes,
university and see some of the work we're doing.
Yeah.
I personally would first visit the Mauritius campus. Yeah. Okay, so we can split. Yes, I can go to Rwanda, I can go to Mauritius.
No, I've been in Rwanda already, so. And
okay.
Kigali is a great city, yeah.
All right.
It certainly is.
I don't want to leave that question in the chat alone, although we have also some questions in the Q&A section. So you have changed the model 2 times. First, multiple universities across different countries, then hubs, and now just 2 universities were integrated, well, 2 campuses integrated with LAX, as far as I understand it. And again, as far as I see from where I'm standing, you have managed to do that without mission drift. How have you accomplished that? Is there an advice hiding somewhere there? Were there moments when it was already, approaching something different that you had in mind in the beginning? What do you say?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And one thing that held true 10 years ago when Fred put the idea to the world and still holds true today is that we don't believe that in the 21st century world that we live in, education and the future of education, we believe that it is on neither of the 2 poles, paradigms, if you will, that we typically look at education, right? There is the fully brick and mortar model that we know, and then there's the fully online model that we also know, right? We've always held true that the solution is somewhere in the middle, right? You have to lean into technology and leverage technology to be able to, whether it's fast tracking learning outcome, or if it is relieving faculty from some of the duties that would prevent them from being able to access more students, right? So so on that spectrum of brick and mortar to fully online, we've always known that it is somewhere. But in the original vision, brick and mortar still played a very big role because that's the reality we were dealing with, right? But then you say, okay, you tech enable within the brick and mortar. The pandemic shifted that massively for us because suddenly the entire world was forced to embrace something else that we were maybe not inclined to before. And when we started seeing that, wait, hold on, you can deliver outcome, that is, again, it's debatable. I would argue marginally inferior by a fully online model. But if you curate it well enough, I'm sure all of us have heard this analogy of like when sort of film came about, right? The first thing the camera came about, first thing we did, we put a camera in front of a theater and said, oh, this is film. But it's still, there's an entry point and an exit point. So you are filming a live performance. And then the technology later on, and today when you talk about film, what do from CGI to all of these different fancy things, making a film, the production of it is different. So Zoom, when pandemic hit, we went back to putting a camera in front of the theater, and we thought that this is what online could do. But then when you actually look at all the tech, and now with the latest disruption, which is AI, now you're starting to see, possibilities like we've never seen before. So do you then need to go and try to, those of us on this call or who will be watching this later on who have built the brick and mortar know it is not easy. It is very capital intensive, and finding patient investment to do this is also not easy, because you need patient investment, patient capital to build brick and mortar, right? And that's not very easy to find. And even when you've got philanthropists like MasterCard Foundation who are willing to support, rarely do they invest or put money behind, sort of CapEx, right? So you see, so you have to take that reality into perspective. So, maybe when Fred gave his TED talk, he said we were going to build 25 campuses. The truth is we have physical presence in actually 25 different cities in Africa, right? In a slightly different format. You see, so for me, this is the innovation. The vision, you've got to stay true to the vision. What was the vision? It's about accessing more young people. Okay, the assumption originally was we're going to do that through brick and mortar. They're all going to be universities. They're going to be accredited and regulated in these countries. Now you're like, well, actually, you don't have to do that, because there are innovations and technologies that allow you to do it differently, right? And that's why we're going to do. And this is my advice to anyone who's trying to do this stuff is like, we've heard this before, don't fall so in love with your solution that you can't see how the world is changing around you and you're not adapting your solution to that, because you will become obsolete very, very quickly, make no mistake.
I'm going to quote you on that. Okay, so we've got 2 questions from the Q&A section, which I would like to ask. They're fairly simple. So the first one is on the slide. You noted that 58% of alumni are male. What is the reason, apart from biology?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, if the question is about what prevents a better gender distribution, again, many realities that many of us are aware, right? A lot of young women, and we actually saw that very concretely with data when COVID happened and we pivoted to online. We sent all of our students home. We flew all of our students back home to their families, and then we pivoted to online. But we could see performance dropping significantly, predominantly with our girls, women. And why? Because very quickly, once they go home, they fall into various sort of gender roles and expectations. And many families didn't see that as, oh, you are just home, but you are still learning. They saw that as, oh, you're home, so do some duties. All of this to say that there are some very specific contexts that affect women and women's ability to access. I would argue that our percentage of 58-42 is pretty good relative to many other institutions that you will find on the continent. But this is a data point. Whoever asked this question, I want you to know that this is a data point that we care very deeply about. Even in our partnership with MasterCard Foundation, the mandate there is actually 2/3 of the scholarship beneficiaries have to be women, people who are either refugees or internally displaced, and people with disability, right? So that these are demographics that we are very intentional about.
Dara, I cannot resist, but I I don't want this question, to be in the very end, because I guess that the major from from the point of view of higher education practitioner, the most strange and strange thing that you proposed in your slide about innovations is, as you say, missions, not majors. Could you explain the kind of mechanic of that? So when, if I am a student and I apply for the university, do I apply for the mission or for engineering? And so, and okay, is the mission just I sign it, everyone is happy, which often happens, we know, and that's it. So how the mission works?
Yeah, no, brilliant question. I want to start by saying that the idea of missions not majors, originally was Stanford about, I think 15 years ago, did a thing called Stanford 2025, where they were trying to imagine what Stanford would evolve to. And then there was this idea of like declaring a mission, not a major. The truth of the fact, guys, is that our students obviously graduate with a degree. Yeah, so they're a major. There is a major, right? So I majored in electrical engineering. I majored in business management. I majored in entrepreneurial leadership. I majored in software engineering. But to your point, Isaac, in all of our students, irrespective of these degree programs, in their first year, everybody does what we call leadership core. Leadership core, there are 4 key modules in it: data and decision, teaching them how to understand data, gather data, manipulate data, visualize data, etc., etc. Communicating for impact, learn how to do academic writing, academic communication, business communication, etc., etc. Again, data visualization, all of that is part of communicating. How do you communicate an idea, etc. Third one is entrepreneurial leadership, really focusing on hard and soft skills, everything from emotional intelligence to human-centered design to hard entrepreneurial sort of skills happens in there. The last one is called projects, whereby we work with real-world industry. I'll give you an example to illustrate it. So one of the projects that we did was with Uber. Uber was trying to determine whether or not they would set up an office in Mauritius. A manager from Uber Johannesburg gets on a call with our students, present the case. This is what this is the problem I'm trying to solve. Our faculty work with our student with all the tools and techniques, project management, etc., to go investigate, come back with recommendations. A week later, they get on a call again with that manager from Uber. They get feedback. They go and iterate. They come back again. You can see all these skills converging here. By the time they finish their first year, they would have done about 7 to 8 similar projects where they've got massive exposure to the real world. From there on, in the second year, they go into specialization. Now is when you would begin, more deeply your electrical engineering or your software engineering, etc., etc. And in that first year, where you're doing leadership core, is when you are also introduced to these 7 grand challenges and 7 good opportunities that I mentioned to you earlier. This is where they learn, various models, including some of you may be aware of like the Ikigai model of like, how do you align your passion, your interest, the cause that you care about in the world and your skills and find that sweet spot. So we actually accompany them on a journey of self-exploration. The kind of stuff that higher ed for a long time said, this is not my responsibility. Your mother should be teaching you values and ethics at home. Your parents should be teaching you what is your purpose in the world. We say no. We want to curriculize that, and we do, right? And then they, it's a scaffolded process whereby even though I'm going to be an electrical engineer, and again, Isaac, I'm give you an example to illustrate the point. One of my alumni right now is he's got a master's degree in electrical engineering and power systems from our university. He's from Mozambique. He comes from a family that has been historically in agriculture. I think he's like first generation to get a university education. He graduated, but because of the entrepreneurial training that he also got at ALU and the engineering, he joined an incubator in Mauritius, incorporated a business, and is working on a technology solution that leverages AI and electrical engineering that is ag related, right? So you see where the mission meets the major, right? So this guy since year one, he's been working on his mission statement. It is around improving agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And he's leveraging his major to design solutions to that end, right? That's sort of how they work hand in hand, right? It is very well scaffolded. There is theoretical underpinning behind these. That's why there's these 7 grand challenges and good opportunities, that, let's say you might say my mission, I'm motivated by, I don't know, a family member of mine got cancer and I care about the issue of cancer. Okay, but how do I build an education journey for you? We say, okay, health. You go into health. Now you get the theoretical underpinning around health, and then you can be a bit more niche. Yeah,
got it. So it's continuous support, reflection on the initial mission statement. It would be very interesting to research it. But that's
definitely.
Dara, please.
Yeah.
So the time has come for the final question. Veda, if you were to advise somebody who is running an innovative university or someone who's thinking about founding one, what would you say?
Be very clear on what are you solving for. Remember the need, remember the problem that you're trying to fix. And if you never lose sight of that, then you will continuously remain innovative because you know what is the change you want to see in the world, right? And then the rest will become, a lot easier to handle because starting afresh, starting new, building, there's a lot of challenges that can very easily detract you from the North Star. So being clear about the North Star. And I know some people would say, know your vision, your mission. Yeah, but too often the vision and the mission can also be tied to a solution. So remember the problem you're trying to solve and stay true to that problem. And the rest will manifest itself in very interesting ways.
But Dara, I cannot, but I have to say that hundreds, thousands of universities spent efforts formulating missions. And in the end, these missions, like siblings, you cannot find the difference. So am I right that the advice is very simple? Think about this mission, formulate it as concrete as possible.
Absolutely. Hands down. Yeah. Because, too often people and institutions craft a mission statement as a tagline, as something to inspire, right? And, there's a reason we are called the African Leadership University. We're crystal clear about who we are. We are proudly African. We're trying to address African needs. Leadership is a solution that is core to who we are, and it is part of our learning philosophy. And we are a university. We signed up to be in higher education, and we ought to behave as such and be regulated as such as well.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Veda. This was brilliant. Could we have our last slide?
Yeah.
So before we close, Isaac?
Yeah, just to say that the video recording will be available on our YouTube channel. Yeah.
Indeed, and you can also share your thoughts with the hashtag Innovative Universities. In the beginning, I forgot to tell everybody about the format again, and now this. Okay. Now back to the upcoming webinar. So next time we will be talking about the University of the People, which is very opposite of the brick and mortar university. It doesn't have any bricks to speak of. So let's see how they're feeling right now. Do they feel they were right all along? Do they feel that the field has been crowded and there is no place for them anymore? So that will be on May the 2nd, same time, same place. In the meantime, please share your thoughts about today's webinar. Please also share the recording. Veda, thank you very much again. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you.